A very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Faculty of Medicine and Dentistry, there can be very few amongst us who don't have families, who don't have family or friends who are afflicted with Alzheimer's disease. It's clear to all of us what a massive problem this is for health and society, and it's a major research endeavor within my faculty. It's thus a delight to introduce Dr. Margaret Locke to you. Dr. Locke is the Marjorie Bronfman Professor Emeritus in Social Sciences in Medicine and is affiliated with the Department of Social Sciences of Medicine and the Department of Anthropology at McGill University. She is internationally regarded as the preeminent medical anthropologist of her generation and has spent the past 30 years of her career building bridges between medicine and the social sciences, making seminal contributions to the theoretical foundations of medical anthropology and, more broadly, the social sciences. Dr. Locke graduated with a biochemistry degree from the University of Leeds in 1961. We're not holding that against her. That was followed by research work in this area in the universities of Toronto and of California. She completed both an MA and a PhD from the University of California at Berkeley. Dr. Locke returned to McGill in 1977 as an assistant professor in medical anthropology in the Department of History of Medicine, and within 10 years rose to the rank of a full professor. She's received numerous awards and accolades throughout her academic career, and I'm just mentioning a few highlights. Dr. Locke, a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, Officer of the National Order of Quebec, the Killam Prize for the Social Sciences from the Canada Council of Arts, the SSHRC Gold Medal for Achievement in Research, Career Achievement Award from the Society of Medical Anthropology, and most recently, in 2010, an Officer of the Order of Canada. We're delighted to welcome you to the University of Alberta.
Trained as a cultural anthropologist, Margaret Locke's research focuses on a comparative anthropology of medicine and biomedical technologies. Her broad scope of work includes studies into cultural aspects of female development and aging, the invention of the concept of brain death, and social repercussions of biomedical technologies. She's the author of several award-winning books, such as East Asian Medicine in Urban Japan, 1980, Encounters with Aging, Mythologies of Menopause in Japan and North America, 1993, and Twice Dead, Organ Transplants and the Reinvention of Death, 2002. Importantly, her works are widely used for teaching and have helped shape healthcare delivery and policy in Canada and Japan. In sum, her work situates science in the human context and fosters the understanding of the interconnections between medicine and the social sciences. At the University of Alberta, our forward-looking Arts and Humanities in Health and Medicine program recognizes this interconnectedness and exists to initiate activity and inquiry into these intersections. On behalf of the Faculty of Arts and the Faculty of Medicine and Dentistry, we are most pleased to welcome Dr. Locke to share with us today her reflections on aging and dementia as situated in the medical and social realities of the 21st century. Dr. Locke.
It's a real pleasure to be here in Edmonton. It's, I think, my third trip to Edmonton over the years. And although this perhaps isn't the very best month of the year, it's marvelous that it's not January, and I'm delighted to be here at the beginning of spring, what has to be the beginning of spring. Some of you may not have cottoned on fully to the little quip made by the Dean of Medicine. He is from Manchester, on one side of the Pennines, of the major mountains in the north of England. The University of Leeds is on the other side. We are arch rivals. We rarely talk to each other. But when I was at Leeds University, I was captain of the squash team, and I have to say that the year I was captain, we beat them silly. So I'd also like to thank SEPA for arranging the huge amount of work they do to make this science and its publics a reality. The organization is absolutely phenomenal, and they do a splendid job of it, and I would like to thank them very much for that too. All right, so as you know, I'm going to be talking about Alzheimer's. It's probably not going to be the kind of things that some people expect. I am not going to deal with caregiving. I'm not going to deal with the individual families and the very, very, very enormous burden that people have in dealing with this condition. I'm dealing much more with the science, which is transforming extraordinarily rapidly in this area, and in large part what those repercussions are for these transformations. Maybe some of them potential, but some of them already well on the way for all of us as members of the public. All of us who are potentially people who could get this condition when we're old enough. Some of us are already there, and I mean old enough. And what I want to emphasize, as you'll see as I go through, is the question of where research subjects are going to come from to do the research that it's now believed is needed and essential for this kind of research endeavor to move ahead. Okay, so I will actually read quite a bit from a text in Faculty of Arts style, but I have some PowerPoints as well, which are largely illustrative of what I'm saying. So don't expect the whole story to appear on the PowerPoint by any means. We live today with a plethora of epidemics. We live with obesity, diabetes, attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder, autism, prostate cancer, breast cancer, HIV, AIDS, avian flu, child abuse, crime, terrorism, and many others. The epidemics are endless. And among this multiplication of epidemics, Alzheimer's disease has recently become very conspicuous in both the media, as I'm sure you've noticed, and also in professional medical journals. Robert Butler, a Pulitzer Prize winner and founding director in 1976 of the NIH National Institute of Aging in the States, argues in his book, The Longevity Revolution, that one of the triumphs of the 20th century has been the dramatic increase in the numbers of people who live to old age. But Butler insists, unless we find ways to prevent or cure Alzheimer's and other severe dementing diseases, the world will shortly be confronted with the epidemic of the 21st century. Extrapolating from this undeniable association between aging and dementia, it would appear that the ever-increasing proportion of elderly people in the world constitutes, in and of itself, a burgeoning pandemic. Now, what I want to do in terms of the PowerPoint is to start out, and I should have done this a paragraph or two ago, is this quotation taken from one of the most famous one of the most famous anthropologists that has ever lived, as a matter of fact, professor of anthropology at Oxford. He worked for many years in the Sudan with the Azandi, and this is one of the famous quotes out of his book. His several books. A man's future health and happiness depends on conditions that are already in existence and can be exposed by the oracles and altered. The future depends on the disposition of mystical forces that can be tackled here and now. Moreover, when the oracles announce that a man will fall sick, his condition is therefore already bad, his future is already part of him. I'd like you to keep that in mind, because I will come right back to this again at the end of the talk, and maybe it will stimulate some of the questions that I'm hoping to provoke from some people. This is Iris Murdoch. Some of you will have read her books. Many perhaps have read her books. Somebody who died of Alzheimer's really quite dramatically. Her story, after the disease struck her, moved along really quite remarkably fast. And this picture is very telling because these are the early days for her. Since Alzheimer's was first formally recognized as a disease in 1908, efforts have been made repeatedly over the intervening years to improve on delineating with ever more accuracy its clinical and neuropathological characteristics. And the ultimate objective of this, of course, is to find a cure, or better yet, to prevent the condition. And a redoubling of these efforts is now taking place to combat what is widely understood as an approaching catastrophe. And a very large number of researchers are currently poised to approach the challenge of Alzheimer's in a radically new way, with the primary emphasis shifting to prevention rather than simply searching for a cure. For some, the hope of prevention lies with the development of a vaccine, so far with no success. Others are working to better understand the molecular changes thought to take place immediately prior to the onset of the final devastating neuropathological changes associated with AD. Yet more researchers believe that the most promising approach lies in delineating pathways understood as prodromal, pre-symptomatic changes that can now be detected in individuals up to 20 years or more before the irreversible final stages of Alzheimer's disease sets in. The hope is that so we're moving backwards in this direction. The hope is that by modulating the molecular changes involved in these very early signs of possible disease, the process will be nipped in the bud long before it's irrevocably underway. But there are problems. Technologies developed over the past decade that facilitate knowledge generation about prodromal dementia have resulted in a flood of research findings that make the prevention of AD a realistic possibility in the minds of many experts. But in order to try to delineate medically what exactly is to count as prodromal dementia, it will be necessary for large numbers of healthy, middle-aged, and perhaps younger people to be selected from the population at large to become research subjects. This research will involve the detection of what are known as biomarkers. I didn't put my pointer out, but the biomarkers, which are thought to indicate the very early changes associated with dementia, long before there are any outward signs of memory loss or other behavioral changes. The dominant biomarkers reckoned to date are three. There are several, but there's three dominant ones. The first is found in cerebral spinal fluid, and I'm not going to talk about that much today, but just to point out that I'm sure something that you all intuitively understand, that it is not a pleasant test to undergo, and certainly not to undergo repeatedly, as is likely to be asked of people. Second are neuroimaging findings, particularly in the form of what is known as PIB scanning, and I'll return to this in a moment. And the third, which I will spend most of the time on, is genetic testing for what is known as the ApoE gene, one form of which has consistently been associated with late-onset Alzheimer's. However, and here's the rub, these biomarkers only indicate increased probability for AD and provide no certain predictions. And what is very troubling is that a good number of people who exhibit one or more of these signs associated with prodromal dementia do not thereafter convert, in the words of the experts, to AD. Similarly, about half the people who are diagnosed in memory clinics with what is known as mild cognitive impairment never convert to AD, and some of them actually do what is informally called rementing. They become themselves again. their memory returns. Results of this kind of testing bring about, in effect, a conflation of normal and pathological. Normal and pathological aging, that is. And, of course, they raise disturbing ethical questions. And furthermore, not only will a good number of people who test positive for one or more of these biomarkers never become demented, even in old age, but, conversely, there's also the possibility, given the rather limited state of the scientific knowledge at present, that some people who test negative for these biomarkers are actually on the road to AD. So before developing this theme further, I want to take a brief diversion to stress that the AD epidemic is a global problem. This isn't something just to be associated with Western countries by any means at all. And in fact, it is in the so-called developing world where people will have the most difficult time. Many countries are hit a lot harder than is Canada. Japan was perhaps the first country to alert its citizens to what was in store with the dramatic aging of its population. Korei Shakai, the aging society, has received a great deal of publicity there for over half a century, and is fearfully anticipated because demographic changes that took 85 years to unfold in Sweden, 130 years in France, and 70 years in the United States have taken just 25 years in Japan. And this transformation, coupled with a drop in the birth rate to 1.8 children per household, has meant that this change is actually more rapid, not just more rapid, but more extreme than in either Europe or North America. And the elderly in Japan now already make up 29% of the entire population, something which perhaps became very visible to some of you if you watched the outcome after the tsunami and the nuclear reactor problem. In Sweden, for example, with the largest number of people in Europe aged 65 and over, the elderly at present comprise nearly 19% of the population. And Sweden has been worrying about this for a long time, but they are way behind East Asia. Increasingly, in Japan, the term Cho Korei Shakai is used, super-aged society, and it's made use of in the Japanese media a great deal to alert people and to keep the government on its toes. And the prediction is that by 2050, the elderly will constitute over 40% of the nation's population. China is just beginning to come to grips with the extent of the problem of their aging society. At present, the future for the elderly and their caregivers looks exceptionally bleak in that country. It's estimated that by 2040, people aged 60 and over will make up about 28% of the population, and in absolute numbers, 397 million people. That's the extent of what that means, by far the majority of whom have no old age security. Worries about the impact of growing ranks of the elderly on the economy and on individual families have been dubbed in China as the 4-2-1 problem. In large part as a result of the one-child policy, it means that a single person in China will soon be expected to help support 2 parents and 4 grandparents. And the media is only now beginning to expose the ignorance and stigma long associated with dementia in China and trying to dispose of this. But still, recognition of dementia simply as an illness is still a long way away. The majority think of dementia as natural and normal, just something one has to live with. Shanghai, for example, is proposing what it calls the 97-3 plan, meaning that 90% of the elderly will be cared for at home, 7% will be permitted to make occasional visits to community centers, and 3% will live in the very limited supply of nursing homes, many of them still under construction. So caregiving for these the children who've grown up as a result of the one-child policy is going to be an enormous burden unless things change. Of great significance is that the proportion of over 80s are increasing everywhere at an unprecedented rate, and centenarians are today the most rapidly growing age group in many countries. It is this extension of life expectancy that has taken everyone by surprise, including demographers. Despite its clinical recognition for many years, Alzheimer's has not been thought of as a major health priority until very recently, and funding has always lagged far behind that allotted for cancer and heart disease. As the Canadian neurogeneticist Peter St. George Hislop puts it, Alzheimer's is not that sexy. It's not hot like breast cancer or HIV, and lobbying efforts fall short when affected people cannot speak for themselves. But however, in the past few years, it appears that the concerted efforts of medical professionals, AD societies, some segments of the media, to make Alzheimer's much more publicly visible as a condition that demands immediate attention for economic, social, and humanitarian reasons is really finally beginning to take off. The first World Alzheimer's Day took place on September the 21st, 2010, accompanied by the publication of a World Alzheimer's Report containing damning figures. And over the past few years, Alzheimer's walks, bike rides, and marathons have all been instituted in North America, Europe, and in parts of Asia. And in addition, Alzheimer's Disease International, the overarching organization, has called for the World Health Organization to make Alzheimer's a global priority. I will just insert here that Canada is running behind. We have no strategic plans in this country at the federal level for dealing with Alzheimer's at all, despite concerted pressure placed on governments over the past years. And we, unlike, in contrast to Australia, New Zealand, Great Britain, even the United States, although actual money has not been allotted in the States, they have President Obama actually did sign a bill to move things forward. In the early years of the 20th century, shortly after the discovery of AD by Alois Alzheimer, supported by the leading German psychiatrist of the day, the very famous Emil Kraepelin, the first step to make it a bona fide disease was to remove it from the catch-all stigmatizing category of insanity and classify it as a neurological condition. However, the undeniable symptoms of what was then universally called senility continued to be thought of as part of normal aging by the majority of the medical profession and the public, and remained hidden and managed as a family matter. And it wasn't until the 1970s, really quite recently, that Alzheimer's was first fully recognized as a disease, first in Europe, North America, and Japan, and then later in many other parts of the world. This medicalization of dementia has resulted in considerable destigmatization of the condition worldwide, and has resulted in very slowly in reducing the terrible conditions that so many of the elderly have had to face. However, it's of note that where comprehensive national healthcare systems are not in place, and this is the case for most countries of the world, where such systems are not in place, this means that the majority of people have to absorb all the caregiving within the family and unaided without any extra assistance. Perhaps the majority continue to think of dementia or senility, as they would often call it, as normal aging, in part because it hasn't been medicalized. That was one of the very positive aspects of creating Alzheimer's as a disease which became fully recognized. And I have no time to develop that history, but it's an interesting history. I'm going to turn now very briefly to some snippets from other aspects of the history of Alzheimer's disease as a background for considering the complexities with which we are confronted with as the AD world moves towards prevention of this condition that has been described in the media as the never-ending death. The innovation that many would agree brought about the discovery of Alzheimer's disease was a special stain, first developed by the Italian scientist Camillo Golgi in 1873, and shortly thereafter modified by the Spanish neurologist and photographer Santiago Ramón y Cajal. This novel technique radically transformed knowledge associated with the then emerging discipline of the neurosciences, and was regarded as such an important breakthrough that these two scientists were jointly awarded the Nobel Prize for Medicine. The new silver precipitation technique was refined in 1902 by the German scientist Max Bielszewski, and shortly thereafter made use of by Alois Alzheimer to stain sections of brain tissue that he'd procured after the death of several patients who would be diagnosed with the disease that was to be called after him. The stained histological slides enabled Alzheimer to see with the aid of a microscope what had not before been evident. The clumped structures he labeled as neurofibrillary tangles that would shortly thereafter be recognized as one of the key autopsy signifiers of Alzheimer's. Neurofibrils are present in normal cells and have been observed before Alzheimer's time, but the slides clearly showed the extent to which they had accumulated excessively to form abnormally dense bundles. And a second signifier of Alzheimer's disease, amyloid plaques, were also visible to Alzheimer when he applied a different stain, but plaques had already been definitively described by several other medical researchers working at the end of the 19th century. Disagreement remains among historians commenting on the discovery of Alzheimer's disease, but many argue that it was the definitive demonstration of the tangles and their interpretation as pathology that brought about a significant shift in thinking, setting medical understanding of dementia firmly on a path that privileged neuropathology and supported the then relatively new theory that neurological and mental illnesses originate with localized changes in the brain. The history of AD is very complex, as I indicated already, but I simply at this point want to stress one point. With great regularity in the intervening 100 years, right down to the present day, reports have appeared that the behavioral changes associated with AD, above all memory loss and disorientation, do not correlate very neatly with autopsy findings of plaques, tangles, and cell loss that are diagnostic of this condition. A relatively recent example of this discrepancy is the widely cited Nun study, in which 678 Catholic sisters who belonged to an order called the School of Sisters of Notre Dame, participated in this study that commenced in 1986 and continued for 2 decades. Statements written by the nuns when they were young women about why they wanted to enter the order, carefully stored for decades, were matched with neuropsychiatric assessments administered throughout the latter part of the lives of these nuns from age 75 on, and then subsequently linked to autopsy findings after death. Each of these nuns had agreed ahead of time to donate their brains to this research. On the basis of this study, it was argued that those nuns who exhibited imagination and complexity in their thinking while young, that is, exhibited high idea density, in the language of the researchers, were less likely to succumb to Alzheimer's disease when they grew older. This finding was not related to number of years of formal education and was borne out as the autopsy results gradually accumulated. 90% of those nuns whose brains exhibited extensive damage at autopsy had shown low idea density as 20-year-olds. This research gave an enormous boost to what is now known as the cerebral reserve hypothesis, in which it's believed that cerebral reserve is protective against AD. Such reserve, it is assumed, is laid down commencing from the time in utero, and recent research suggests that epigenetics may well be involved, making the picture yet considerably more complex. But I don't have time to talk about this, but I will say that I have considerable reservations about a simplified version of the cerebral reserve hypothesis. I don't believe it's simply a matter of how many neurons and synapses you've built up. I think it's a lot more to do with larger environmental issues, which are related to building up of neurons, to do with toxic exposures and poverty and things like that. Of even greater interest was the finding that a small proportion of the nuns, and this is relevant for what I'm talking about today, who coped very ably with the neuropsychological battery of tests administered to them, turned out at autopsy to have extensive signs of plaques and tangles, confirming the same inconclusive observations that had been made repeatedly since Alzheimer's time, but sort of pushed to one side. And conversely, it was also clear that a few individuals whose autopsied brains revealed a relatively small number of pathological changes exhibited all the behavioral signs of dementia while alive. Similar anomalies have been noted again and again and are documented in passing in textbooks on Alzheimer's disease. A very recent, particularly robust, as they say in epidemiology, study virtually ensures, I think, that these anomalies simply will not be set aside much longer, that they will be taken up and thought about seriously. The case control study that I want to mention, which was carried out in Cambridge in England, assessed the neuropathological status at death of 456 individuals who'd agreed to donate their brains for research and had previously been tested clinically for AD. These findings showed, as expected, that the neuropathological features believed to be diagnostic of Alzheimer's disease and dementia, including plaques, tangles, and cell loss, are more evident in older than in younger subjects. No surprise there. However, what was surprising was that although the correlation between clinically diagnosed Alzheimer's and post-mortem neuropathology was strong in the group aged 75 and under, this finding was shown to be less and less consistent with increasing age, less and less strong correlation until, in effect, there's no obvious correlation. The researchers concluded that there is a considerable overlap in neuropathological features present at post-mortem between those over 75 clinically diagnosed with dementia while alive and those without dementia who are people who were thought of as, in quotes, normal. Once again, the entanglement of aging and Alzheimer's has come to the fore, and it's proving very difficult to unravel this. There is no single sign of Alzheimer's which is not present in normal brains. Recently, it's been possible to use neuroimaging to demonstrate for the first time plaques in the living brain. And this is a breakthrough that's been heralded with great possibilities for the future. And it's one of the biomarkers I mentioned briefly at the beginning. However, once again, there have been some unsettling surprises. PIB neuroimaging, as it's called, doesn't show a significant correlation between amyloid load, that is, between the plaques in the brain, in the living brain, and cognitive impairments in people who've been tested in the clinic. Virtually all the imaging studies to date have shown that approximately 30% of so-called normals have neuropathology in their brains, which means that it is perhaps time for at least those of us a little more philosophically inclined are likely to say, what the heck is this thing called neuropathology in this particular case? Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. Perhaps we're not looking at the right things quite. We're looking at something a little off target. The unanswered question is whether or not these people are on their way to AD and have been caught very early, or alternatively, do some people have sufficient plasticity in their brains or cognitive reserve to fend off the supposed extensive damage done by plaques? Or are plaques simply, possibly, the wrong target? But there's a third way of thinking about this paradox. Perhaps we should assume that all humans are inevitably, all of us, every one of us, are inevitably on our way to dementia as part of the wear and tear of the aging process. But that some of us will cross a dementia threshold much earlier than do others, or somewhat earlier than do others. And of course, at this stage in the life cycle, a lot of us are dropping dead of other things anyway, making it even more complex to tease this all apart. Could it be that there's a combination of genetic heritage and social, political, and environmental factors that are very much at work that could account for quite a lot of these discrepancies? But where we are at present is that interpreting what plaques in the living brain imply and talking about such findings with the subjects who have been tested is a horrendously difficult and sensitive ethical question. And most people working on this agree that subjects should not be shown their PIB scan results as yet, but a few clinics, all in America, have gone ahead and are beginning to do this. All right, so now I want to turn to genetic testing for the last part of the talk. And I want to talk about the ApoE gene, which is the best studied of the biomarkers for AD to date. Official guidelines in Europe and North America are at present opposed to the routinization of individual testing for the particular allele of the ApoE gene, known as ApoE4, associated with the common late onset form of Alzheimer's disease, for which any one of us may be vulnerable. At present, ApoE testing is virtually limited to research settings and for use in clinics to help confirm a diagnosis, at which time the genotype is not disclosed to the patient or the family, although once again there are some clinics that are not adhering to this rule. There are, however, some commercial companies that offer testing. It's very hard to tell how much people take up this kind of testing because the companies won't tell you, but it's very clear that it's much, much lower than is the case for breast cancer, for example, for the breast cancer genes. As basic science research into AD forges ahead, showing, among many other things, that the metabolism of glucose and insulin is implicated with dementia, certain neuroscientists are beginning to actively push for routine ApoE testing of healthy individuals, especially those who come from families where AD has already been diagnosed. They believe that if people learn that they carry the E4 allele, they're much more likely to make significant dietary and lifestyle changes. I don't agree with this in the way that it's framed, because just about every one of us needs to make significant dietary and lifestyle changes for all sorts of other reasons. And this is just another add-on to what we should be doing anyway. It was recognized as early as the 1930s that autosomal dominant genes, i.e. genes that determine disease, are implicated in what is known today as early onset Alzheimer's. And this rare form of dementia, from which Alzheimer's most famous patient, Auguste D., suffered, is associated with 3 specific genetic mutations, all of which have been mapped. And the Canadian geneticist, Peter George Hislop, has been absolutely central in this work. However, it's not strictly true to claim that the gene determines this Mendelian form of the disease, because at the age of onset for identical twins can vary by as much as a decade, a considerable difference, and suggesting that other things are implicated even in these kind of gene, when these genes are present. This kind of early onset disease is rare. It only occurs in approximately 700 extended families worldwide. We probably really don't know the number very accurately. There are lots of places that haven't been investigated adequately. But the estimates are that the total number of cases of this kind of Alzheimer's are between 2 and 5% of all cases of Alzheimer's. And I'm not going to talk more about this today. In 1993, the first publication appeared that explicitly made an association between the ApoE gene and an increased risk for the common late-onset form of AD. And after some initial skepticism, this finding was heralded with great excitement on the assumption that the Alzheimer's puzzle might soon be solved. Furthermore, it forced some revisions of received wisdom of the day, namely that Alzheimer's disease in older people had nothing to do with genetics. And from that point on, people had to rethink this, although there is also what is also called sporadic cases, or are sporadic cases of Alzheimer's as well. The ApoE gene is found on chromosome 19. It's present in all mammals, which is significant. It's essential for lipid transport and cholesterol metabolism. And in humans, it comes in 3 possible variations. The ApoE2, which in so-called white populations is in between 7 and 8% of the population. The ApoE3, which is by far the most common allele in humans, 77 to 78% of a so-called white population, and the ApoE4, which occurs in 14 to 16% of a white population. Other populations have not been studied well enough as yet, although data is beginning to come out of China, where a lot of work is now taking place. The presence of one E4 allele accelerates the age of onset of AD by about 3 to 4 years. And for carriers of 2 E4 alleles, the age of onset may be 8 to 10 years earlier than non-carriers. And sometimes this form progresses faster than when age of onset is later. The majority of Alzheimer's in older people begins to set in around age 70, and then it increases as with increased aging, although there's a very interesting, somewhat anomalous finding that in people who are over 100, things seem to be stabilized. And some people hypothesize that these are the people with a very special array of genes, but we haven't tested that out yet. The 8 E2 alleles appear to be protective. What I want to note is that among all the other mammals except us, none of these variations occur. Every single mammal, including the higher primates, are all E4. What this suggests is, very clearly, is that some evolutionary change has taken place throughout the life of Homo sapiens. We have adapted to our different environments and lifestyles, and E4 now obviously performs, in some instances, a different function than it did or does continue to perform for the apes and other mammals. So these genes have been, as I said, studied since the early 1990s. But a couple of neurogeneticists, very well-known neurogeneticists, argue as follows. They say that while the genetic association per se of ApoE4 with AD has been extremely well established over the past decade, there is no consensus as to how this association translates pathophysiologically. nor how it functions in conjunction with the other numerous candidate genes. And when they say numerous, they mean numerous. They're up in the order of the 50s. Okay, so, and there are, I'm not going to go into the details, but genome-wide association studies that some of you no doubt have heard of are taking place in Britain, America, and in France, and in an effort to find out what other genes are involved. But there is already strong agreement that no gene that accounts for much of increased risk will be found. That there are, it appears, a good number of other genes that are implicated under certain circumstances, but that none of them will have very much explanatory power. What I failed to say, which is very important from the point of view of what I'm going to go on to, is that for people who carry the E4 allele, at least 50% of these individuals, as far as we can tell from quite extensive research, never get Alzheimer's disease. This indicates very clearly that the E4 gene, the ApoE4, is neither necessary nor sufficient for Alzheimer's disease, and it makes the question of predicting which of these carriers are really, indeed, at increased risk extraordinarily hard. And in addition, between 30 and 50% of people who are E4, sorry, I've lost the thread of that one. 30 and 60% of patients diagnosed with late onset AD do not carry the E4 allele. So we have a very, very large number of cases of Alzheimer's disease where this gene is not implicated. It makes the picture very, very complicated, and I know there's a good number of, or probably a good number of medical people, or there's certainly some geneticists in the audience. What I need to also emphasize with you particularly is that the AD phenotype is quite a mess. And what this means is that we don't have a decent population database on which to estimate increased individual risk. And we are a very long way from getting there, because there is ongoing disagreement about actually what will count as AD. There's good diagnosis that's done in memory clinics, which has a high sensitivity and specificity rate. The majority of people diagnosed with Alzheimer's never get near a memory clinic, and the diagnosis is quite a mess. Everybody acknowledges this. It means that getting risk estimates is extraordinarily difficult. Molecular and population genetics has amply demonstrated that genes are shapeshifters without peer. The products of evolutionary and recent human history, dietary and climatic patterns, toxic environments, human social behavior, and at times, quite often actually at times, of serendipitous mutations. And the ApoE gene is no exception to this. For example, the polymorphism ApoE4 has been shown to work in unexpected ways in specific populations. Among pygmies and the Kung San in central southern Africa, and other groups of people whose subsistence economy has until recently been that of hunting and gathering, possession of an E4 genotype apparently protects against AD. This needs a lot more research to try and account for this. And this finding holds for age. The first thing that most people say is, well, they're all dropping dead at 50. This is not true, and it holds for age. And there's also been research that good research that's been carried on for years in parts of, outside Lagos in Nigeria. And there, the presence of an E4 allele doesn't appear to place individuals at increased risk for AD. But on the other hand, this allele is significantly associated with increased risk for AD among African Americans. And there is some good overlap between those particular Nigerian populations and a large number of slaves who were brought to America. The data is considered sufficiently robust to draw some conclusions. It was carried out by a very famous epidemiologist. And the assumption at the moment is that there must be risk-enhancing factors in North America and perhaps risk-reducing factors present in Nigeria, which need to be investigated very carefully. Many researchers and clinicians in the Alzheimer's world argue that there's been an overemphasis on the significance of the ApoE gene. And they argue that we need to pay much more attention to things like toxic environments, head trauma, especially in this country maybe, education levels, chronic stress, diet, possibly prions, and so on. And that all of this has been obscured by genetic hype, by gene hype. But even so, the testing for ApoE is definitely expanding. So what I want to finish up with is some results from an NIH randomized controlled trial. This trial is called the REVEAL study, which is risk, I always forget what, risk evaluation and education for Alzheimer's disease. And the actual controlled trial part of this study is the first column, where all the trial participants amount to 442. I'm not doing well with this today. I will just, oh, here we go. So that's those are the people that were part of the trial. And these were carried out at 4 sites. These were carried out initially at Cornell University in New York City, at Case, what we now call Case University in Cleveland, and at Boston University in Boston. And then a 4th group were added on, the Howard group, who are all African American. The others are all essentially white, or a little hard to tell, but they're dominantly white. Those of you who are interested can read those figures for yourselves. What is important about these people is that none of them have Alzheimer's. They come from Alzheimer families where 1 or more people have been diagnosed, but they themselves are perfectly healthy. I was asked to add a qualitative component to this project, and this accounts for these 79 people who we interviewed a year after they had been given their genotype and increased risk estimates. Meantime, they'd had genetic counseling 3 times during the course of that year, very intense genetic counseling. I agreed to take part in this, provided I brought along my own money so that I could stay at a distance from this project if I wanted to. In other words, my results may not corroborate what they found. And in some ways, they are different, although there are overlaps as well. And I won't be able to get into the fine-tuning of this. But I expressed my doubts about the worth of this study right from the outset. And they agreed that, nevertheless, we could do some qualitative interviewing, i.e. one-on-one, open-ended interviews with 79 volunteers who agreed to come back to talk to us. And that's what I want to show you, is the result of that. This is the protocol for those of you who are interested in this kind of thing. There was careful screening for psychiatric impairment, ruling out a good number of people, education before people could even enter into this trial, before blood draw. There was not a high dropout rate, and it was a randomized trial. The people who were not, as part of the control group, they were not given their ApoE genotype, and they were so furious about this that they rebelled. And finally, the researchers broke down, and at the end, after the year of follow-up, they did give them their genotype and their increased risk estimate. We can go back to this. I don't want to bore everybody with this, but these are the increased risk estimates. If there's a biostatistician in this room who knows a bit about this kind of thing, they may well feel, as I do, that there are problems with these increased risk estimates. But not surprisingly, the increased risk, and this is a homozygous E4 person, or with the people, it does increase quite dramatically. But a good number of biostatisticians suggest that it should even out much long before this because of the earlier death rate. And this is what somebody who is homozygous for 3-3, which is by far the majority of people, the kind of graph that they were presented with. And you may be able to think about it the way that I do, which is that, I mean, these people do come from a family where people are affected by Alzheimer's, but their own risk falls on this same line as that for just because of having a family member is what raises their risk and not their ApoE genotype. Most people went away from this. Well, I'll tell you how most people went away from this. They went away confused. Everybody got the education session. I can't emphasize that too much. And part of the education session made it very clear that the ApoE gene does not cause Alzheimer's disease, and everybody, in theory, internalized that. There was one person who has a family where 7 members have Alzheimer's, and she tested positive for the E4 gene, and she said, I don't believe it. Of course the gene does it. But she was the only person, and she does not know what the genotype is of her 7 affected members. They may not overlap with hers, or at least only 1 or 2, perhaps. So when asked to recall their ApoE genotype, only 27% of them got it right. And even though they had had it written down for them and they were given a copy of their increased risk graph, a large number of the people we talked to couldn't find their graph. They knew it would help to have looked at it before they talked to us. They couldn't find it. It was stuffed away in the back of a drawer somewhere, or they'd thrown it out or something like that. And so what we have is 73% who, in our estimate, essentially had forgotten, mixed up, or were confused about their results. This is despite 4 rounds of close genetic counseling. And these people are not stupid. 3 groups have 17 years or more of education, and the African Americans had 15 years or more of education. These people are intelligent, thoughtful people. One person in an audience I gave this information to said, well, they're getting Alzheimer's, what do you expect? This is rubbish. These people are much too young to be getting Alzheimer's. Most of them were able to say, well, I have a good gene or I have a bad gene. But you know, I think that that's not really quite adequate, because that suggests that the E3 is not going to do any damage and the E4 is going to do damage. It's not a good way of thinking about this at all. Individuals many of them were very confused. And among the majority, those who found out that their genotype is 3-3, for example, Adele had the following to say. She said, according to that test, I don't have the risk, okay? And actually, you see, it isn't okay. She comes from a family where people have been diagnosed with Alzheimer's. But if you can't sort of say, no, Adele, it's not okay, let's try and get this straight. So she says, I don't have the risk, okay? So technically, I should feel better. But I don't believe it, given that there are 4 people in my family with the disease. What we don't know is whether all her family members are also 3-3. They could be, and they could have the disease, and it would be extremely interesting to get to know that, but none of us know it. This is one of the limitations of this study. If you only take selected individuals and you can't put them into the context of their family genotypes, you've got very limited information. Very hard to interpret. Other informants clearly expressed their confusion about the test results. From one meeting to the next, I could come in and I couldn't remember what my risk was. And to this day, I'm not 100% sure, but I know that it's elevated. And the second says, I don't remember much, to be truthful, not much. I'm sure I have it, my risk estimate, somewhere, but I just don't remember. And one lady who I remember talking to, who I immediately took to a great deal, she said, well, she said, I know where I'm at. I know where I stand. I can let my kids know where we all stand. You know, I mean, maybe get it, Maybe not. So, a lot of these people use a concept which is called blended inheritance, which is a concept in which you don't actually use Mendelian thinking to understand what is going on. And you use theories about likeness, family likeness, to assess who among you is going to get this condition. I showed you the picture of me and my dad. We look like clones, practically, physically. And nobody's really said, I don't know whether or not that makes a difference, a person's physical appearance, but I have a suspicion that it does. And Robert said, do I think I have a higher than normal chance? Yes, heredity. And also, I'm so much like my mother, who had Alzheimer's. There's a very high likelihood that one or more of her children will have a predisposition towards it. And I would say that I'm front runner because of so many other characteristics that are very much like my mother's. We had this kind of comment again and again. Not in the majority of people, but I would say in a third of people, they would come up with this. And we were not asking for this kind of comment. This sprang out of them voluntarily. They do hold multi-causal explanations for the origin of Alzheimer's, sometimes quite complex and quite interesting. Most people think that genetics play a part, but they come up with a whole list of other things that are also implicated, including aluminum saucepans. If anyone still thinks that's a problem, just forget it. It's not as we've decided. For the time being, we've decided that's not a problem. And what happens in the end is that these people, a lot of these people come around to the idea that their family history is the most important thing, much more than getting this genotype, which is, I'm sure, why they don't bother to remember it very carefully. And many of their primary care physicians think exactly the same thing. And I think they're right, both of them, in doing this. Okay, so let me just give you a couple of conclusions, and then I want to show 4 or 5 pictures. If you recall, ages ago, I started out with a quote by the famous anthropologist Evans Pritchard about divination. And I want to say that my position about this is that, particularly as we move into this era of doing preventive therapy, or trying to develop preventive therapies for Alzheimer's and focusing on biomarkers, that my position is essentially that we are practicing or beginning to practice a new form of divination. Because what happens here is something that is absolutely classical for divination, that you get a certain decontextualized thing sorted out for you by divination, but it raises as many uncertainties as many more uncertainties that are never satisfied. It raises a whole new set of ideas and thoughts about what the future might have in store for you. And apart from anything else, with this particular condition, most of these people are primarily concerned about caregiving, and they're not primarily concerned at this stage about themselves. They worry now and then a bit, but the majority are really overwhelmed with looking after their elders themselves. A recent article in the British Medical Journal by 2 highly respected researchers states that there will be no silver bullet for AD, and AD and other dementias are now thought of by many and described by many in the professional literature as a syndrome rather than a disease. This means that there's going to be a lot more research to try and create new taxonomies, and we could end up with subtype 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We could end up with something more complicated. Meantime, some people are going back to the term dementia, the overarching term, and one of very famous neurologists has written a book called The Myth of Alzheimer's Disease, which he got into a lot of trouble for doing this. I told him not to use that title, but he went ahead and used it. I think that I could handle learning my APOE results. I would probably do what most of these people in Reveal did, which is essentially not to have it anywhere near the surface of my mind. It's sort of irrelevant. The question is, will they think more about it when they're 60 and 70? Perhaps they will, we don't know. But I would be concerned about having a PIB scan and discovering that my brain was full of plaques, as it might well be, given my age. I don't know quite what I would make of that. I think that would be a cause for anxiety, and we're in a position where that may be happening to some people. All right, so let me just finish up with these pictures from William Utemolen drew these self-portraits once he'd been diagnosed with Alzheimer's at the request of his psychiatrist, and he agreed to do this. It was immediately, he was diagnosed very young, and this was immediately after he was diagnosed. And you can already see a very worried face, and he's framed his face. He is set off from the real world already. This one has an even more troubled face 2 years later, and he had agreed to donate his brain for autopsy. And here is something that translates as the knife of the neuropathologist, and marked worry on his face. The same year is this self-portrait, very troubling pictures. At age 74, he paints himself. When he does paint himself, he has facial dysmorphia, an unbalanced face, which is not the reality of his face at all. And he's very concerned about one of his ears, which has always been somewhat bigger than the other ear, and it always bothered him, and this becomes a kind of obsession when he becomes really sick. He has a family. He has a wife who's looking after him all this time, keeping him at home right until the very end. He has lots of friends, and there are very, very sad pictures that he paints of him sitting to one side while everybody else is round the dining table or the kitchen table talking away, and he's off over there. Whether he really was there, we don't know. Whether it's his absent mind that is there, we don't know. This one is not dated. And then this is, again, when he was 62, obviously having a terribly sad day. Okay, thank you very much.
I'd like to start today by thanking Dr. Locke for being here, and also for thanking the Situating Sciences Cluster Grant and the workshop on science, technology, and society, who gave me the opportunity to speak here today. I would like to say that my training is as an anthropologist, and while there are many rich stepping off points for starting a discussion in this material, I'm going to be responding today as an anthropologist, and specifically as an anthropologist of science, technology, and medicine. And I'm going to read a comment followed by question. Drawing on the classic work of E. Evans Pritchard, Locke likens the ongoing search to biomarkers to the practice of divination to characterize a transition in Alzheimer's research from cure to prevention. Unlike with anatomoclinical diagnosis, where symptoms index unfolding disease processes, a preventative approach relocates this process temporally. In the work of identifying prodromes or indexing symptoms to come, or indexes of symptoms to come. Such an approach shapes how bodies can be read. The body in any one moment is both present and future, both normal and pathological. Prevention requires prognostication. But, as Locke elegantly shows, from the perspective of scientific research, this is a hairy process at best. Scientists working in this area face the challenges of creating links between a range of shifting and mutable elements. Genes are shaped by environment and lifestyle, and their role as preventative or correlative to pathophysiology depends on context. Brains are plastic, resulting in multiple possible disease trajectories, where they may partially dement and then remint. Traditional signifiers of Alzheimer's found in brains on autopsies, neurofibrillary bundles, amyloid plaques, and cell loss, bear an ambiguous relationship to behavioral manifestations of Alzheimer's disease, memory loss, and disorientation. Based on autopsy evidence, it appears that some with many clinical indicators are cognitively intact, while others with no indicators become demented. In contrast, PIB neuroimaging to visualize plaques in the living brain don't correlate with amyloid load or level of cognitive impairment. If scientists do succeed in developing a vaccine for Alzheimer's disease, it will likely be quite different in nature from those developed for infectious diseases. The likelihood is that scientists will need to account for multiple disease trajectories with more links in working out the paths to dementia. Vaccine development for infectious disease requires decontextualization of knowledge to create an intervention that is universally effective. As Locke has shown, Alzheimer's facts are highly contextually dependent, which makes vaccines more likely than a vaccine. While uncertainty is central in the sciences, with various publics, it plays second fiddle to the family. Kinship looms large as the trope into which ambiguous genetic information is enfolded and made sense of. Global discourses about the Alzheimer's epidemic register not the vagaries of genes, plaques, and tangles, but in terms of its implications for the family. The 421 problem and the 97-3 problem, or plan. Research subjects are most motivated by relationality, that is, the desire to find a cure for suffering relatives, and secondarily by the chance to know which alleles they possess. Unsurprisingly, at least in the REVEAL study, 87% of those who volunteer themselves are women. Many of these women also find themselves in the roles of caregiving for increasingly forgetful relatives. And I'd be interested in hearing if this gendered trend seems to be continuing throughout other Alzheimer's trials. People draw more strongly on family resemblance, being like one's dad or one's auntie, in their prognostications about their own disease futures. And this returns us to divination. As you'll see, I have a different read of Evans-Pritchard than Dr. Locke's. Divination is a set of practices intended to locate the source of some misfortune through the identification of a witch. Evans-Pritchard's Witchcraft, Oracles, and Magic among the Azandi is a foundational text in the anthropology of science and has been interpreted and reinterpreted in debates about the rationality of humans and of science. Evans-Pritchard posits that the practices of witchcraft, magic, and divination together make up a closed system of meaning, which is capable of making sense of any occurrence. In other words, uncertainty is an impossible outcome in any instance of divination, and Zandi are not interested in asking questions that might falsify the system. He also is clear to distinguish this system from practical knowledge of the world and its properties. While Zandi know that a granary falls because the supporting posts are rotted, the logic of witchcraft is used instead to answer the question, why me? Why now? Why did the granary fall when Sally was sitting under it? Ultimately, witchcraft is entirely relational. The practice of the diviner identifies troubled social relationships and demands recompense to restore social order. Michael Polanyi, Peter Winch, Charles Taylor, Stanley Tambaya, and many others have used Evans-Pritchard's work to argue for various positions related to the rationality or irrationality of both non-Western and Western science. I would like to invite Dr. Locke to further situate this work and her use of Evans-Pritchard in relation to these debates, perhaps through the term pragmatic reductionism. How is biomarker testing a new form of divinatory practice? Thank you.
Well, yes, that's a very pertinent. Where are you? Yeah, a very pertinent comment, and maybe I will rethink using Evans-Pritchard, but I will absolutely not drop the divination, because He is talking about a very specific and limited concept of divination as it is practiced among the Azandi. And in many, many other parts of the world, in fact, to have witchcraft involved with divination is really very unusual. And thank you for that cautionary note. Most anthropologists love Evans Pritchard, but I will drop him and I'll find stuff from the I Ching, and I will find stuff from India and from Japan and from Latin America, none of which involves witchcraft, and which are open, much more open systems in which you don't question the diviner, but you sure go home and question with each other. And that's what a huge amount of medical anthropology has shown when one goes to a shaman for healing practices. It does not limit questioning. It is possible that Evans Pritchard was wrong, but I'm not going to take Evans Pritchard on. But I will absolutely not drop the divination. And someone like Nadia Seremantakis, who worked in the Mani with the Greek people and divination practices in the Mani, is a fine example of how people rely on divination quite a lot to understand or try to understand their future. It's close to something that we might want to gloss as fortune telling, perhaps. And that what it does very clearly, and the work of the Danish medical anthropologist Susan Reynolds White also shows this actually for Africa, but not the Sudan, further down in East Africa. She shows very clearly that what it does is to raise many, many more uncertainties than were there before. It doesn't close your mind. But I'm not going to go back and challenge Evans Pritchard, let him rest in peace. But there's plenty of other, in fact, the majority of examples about divination are not closed systems at all. Okay, was that, you had another question about, right. That was in my follow-up study, yes. The original study is much more balanced. And what I didn't take time to explain is that all of these subjects are already people who are signed up as on medical registries to be called upon for trials or for experimentation of one kind or another. And their prime... Not specifically Alzheimer's. No. But this particular group were interested in Alzheimer's because they come from AD families, and that was why they were chosen. But they were on medical registries already, although some of them were approached through their practitioners. And it is fairly balanced between men and women. It's a bit more women than men, but not that much more. In our one, a year later, the men had given up and didn't want to come in specially to see us again, and women being women did come in to see us again. So ours is a bit top-heavy. Yeah. But so again, this sample is not necessarily representative. These are highly motivated people who've gone to the trouble of putting themselves down on medical registries. They're very concerned about Alzheimer's disease, and their prime motive for doing this is to help research, not to find out about their genotype.
Thank you, Dr. Locke, for a very interesting discussion. I am from medical genetics, and we often get asked about by patients through their doctors what the risk is for dementia, and of course there's more types than just Alzheimer's disease. We do not do testing for ApoE for all the reasons that you've pointed out, and people ask us specifically, we explain why. We will arrange for genetic testing with St. George Hislop if it appears to be early onset. And we do explain the difference between the two when patient comes from counseling. But my experience with patients is not that they want to know their risk for Alzheimer's disease. What they really want from me is a test that says, no, you won't get it.
Yes.
And which is quite a different thing.
Yes.
And unfortunately, we're even farther away from that endpoint.
Yes. I agree with you, and I think this accounts in part for the kinds of results that we're getting from these people who don't appear to. I mean, the comments, they're really pretty dissatisfied with the whole process, and they hope in some way that they've helped research, but it hasn't really helped them. because, of course, they want to know that they're not going to get it. And they all learned very quickly that nobody was going to tell them that. Yeah.
Hi. Related a little bit to the artwork that you presented.
Yeah.
A thought that had occurred to me prior to that was, I'm sure that a number of physicians and writers and other verbally articulate people have passed away from Alzheimer's.
Yes.
And have they left us diaries, records,
Yes.
or other that help us understand the very, very earliest and then
Yes.
later?
Yes, there's a very large literature. Less, well, of course, Rothko is the most famous artist. And there are a few other well-known artists who were demented. So there is a heritage there. And this man is quite well known. He's a very he's in Washington in the National Art Museum, I think. There's more writers. There's a lot of people. They're mostly not professional writers, and someone like Iris Murdoch did not write, although if you look closely at her last novel, a lot of people believe that they can now tell that she clearly had it when she was writing that last book. But there's a lot of people who are maybe not gifted authors, but they have tried to struggle with this by getting it down on paper. And there are also quite a number of people who've become professional Alzheimer patients who go on the junket with the doctors when the doctors are giving talks to the public. And these people will often give a brief talk right at the beginning to, sponsored by the Alzheimer's associations, to make it clear that it is not a living death. Usually that's what they're saying, one way or another, that you can manage with the right kinds of support for a good long time.
And is this information available to the average human being? Like, is there published work accessible through normal libraries, or is it all simply in research terms?
Yes, there may even be sections in public libraries by now. I have a whole shelf of these. I can't come up with a list of names because I haven't paid attention to them lately, but you will find them for sure if you Google. Yes. Yeah. There's one that's called Still Alice, which some people might know, which is a beautiful book, really beautiful.
I'd just like to congratulate you, Professor Locke, on a very dynamic lecture that has described very brilliantly the many, many puzzles of this disease. As a retired geriatrician, I think it would be neglectful if we didn't mention that there is an army of workers from many different disciplines working in association with or in association with the different universities of Canada and in the small towns as well. And thank God for those people, or else the battle would be even more one-sided than it has been.
That's right. Yes, it's easy to talk about memory clinics, but the hard work doesn't go on. Well, it is hard work, but what family doctors and GPs do and all the associated professionals is just phenomenal.
Dr. Locke, could you say something about what might be some of the environmental factors that give rise to Alzheimer's?
This has not been studied well yet. There is now a section of the National Institute of Aging which is devoted to the epigenetics of Alzheimer's disease, and they are beginning to get a program together. In fact, the research on environmental matters is very, very poorly done, in my opinion, and has been under-researched by a long way. It's always been hard to get research money to do this kind of thing. There is some clear work to do with early toxicity on brain development and brain functioning, so that small children exposed to lead and other toxins are likely to have abnormal brain development, which will have a lifelong effect. But the cerebral reserve hypothesis has taken center stage, and that gets presented as something which I, as an anthropologist, find quite objectionable, which is the idea that those of us with higher education are more protected than other people who do not have higher education. What this is a mask for a proxy of what happens in poverty and when one lives in poverty and social deprived environments, which reflects in diet and in behavioral styles throughout life, starting very early in age. It is true that quite often those people do not have as much education as some others, but it's not a simple story of you went to university and you didn't, which is almost the way it's presented sometimes. What is underplayed, and what I'm disappointed about, but it's not surprising, what is underplayed is what is often called the social determinants of ill health. And that is an area that has to be investigated much more profoundly. And there are beginning to be some interesting studies. There is a group in Chicago that are doing good epidemiological population studies, and they have looked at community support and social affiliations and have come up with some very positive figures about how this appears to actually protect against Alzheimer's becoming, well, certainly moving along so fast. And we need an awful lot more research like that.
Well, this sort of comes on the heels of that, and I'm wondering if there's been any research done or problematizing personality traits, you know, characteristics that have been done on other kinds of research around autoimmune disorders.
I'm not the person to ask about that. As far as I know, I don't think there has. There's nothing that's hit me over the head, but I've never done a search on that. And I think that it's unlikely that it would be done, because with the kind of approach that makes neuropathology absolutely fundamental, and that the neuropathology causes the disease, that's not going to encourage research that deals with personality traits at all. So I suspect that it's very underserved. It's not something that you see coming up a great deal. Or in fact, I haven't seen it at all. Pardon? Yeah, but that comes under the cognitive reserve category rather than personality type. You could extrapolate maybe to personality type, but they did not do that. They wanted to situate it very firmly in this concept of cognitive reserve, i.e. it's directly related to neuron development.
Hi. I came across an article a while ago about how they did a study with lab rats where low-level electromagnetic radiation, such as from a cell phone, actually led to the breakdown of the proteins that build up that cause, that they think leads to Alzheimer's. I'm just wondering if you have any comments on studies such as those.
I think I saw a comment recently that said that they decided that wasn't the case any longer.
Oh, okay.
You might want to go back and Google some more, but and I could be wrong, but I think I half noticed that they'd backtracked on that one. Yeah.
I do have a couple of remarks. On behalf of the Canadian Centre for Ethics and Public Affairs, we wanted to thank Genome Alberta and Mike Spear for their support. I personally wanted to thank that man over there, Robert Smith, who is the node coordinator for the Situating Science Cluster Grant, who has done all the organization for this event. And I would like to thank you all for coming. Thank you.